Blood trickled from Deputy James Carson's split lip as Police Chief Marcus Wilson Jones towered over him, his voice a low growl slicing through the stunned silence of the West Point precinct. "That quiet old lady you assaulted at Sunrise Cafe," Marcus said, his eyes blazing with restrained fury. "She raised me." The room froze, officers exchanging uneasy glances as the weight of those words sank in. 6 months ago, Eleanor Johnson Washington just wanted her morning coffee. Now, her quiet dignity was rewriting the future of an entire city. Welcome to At the Jones Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of courage that ignite change. Before we dive into this gripping story of justice and standing up against discrimination, I need you to do 2 things. First, drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Second, if you believe every person deserves respect, no matter their skin color, smash that like button to help us reach 1,000 likes. Let's inspire the world together. Subscribe to At the Jones Life Stories and share this video with someone who needs to see what one woman's strength can do. Now let's rewind 6 months to West Point, Mississippi, where it all began. The morning sun filtered through the smudged windows of Sunrise Cafe, casting golden patches across the worn linoleum floor. Eleanor Johnson Washington, 68, pushed open the glass door, her sensible shoes tapping softly, a rhythm as steady as her resolve. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly pinned, her navy dress pressed to perfection, a silent declaration of the dignity she'd carried through a lifetime of challenges. As the retired principal of West Point High School, Eleanor had shaped nearly half the town over her 40-year career, earning nods of respect from locals as she headed to her usual window table. Her morning ritual was sacred: black coffee, buttered toast, and the crossword puzzle, a quiet pause before volunteering at the community center on Oak Street, where she taught literacy classes and mentored young people. Today, however, the cafe's calm was fractured by raucous laughter from a corner table. A group of uniformed police officers held court, their voices loud and unapologetic. At the center was Deputy James Carson, a 38-year-old white officer whose reputation for racial bias was an open secret in West Point's black community. His stocky frame leaned back in his chair, his voice booming as he recounted, teaching some punk kid a lesson on last night's patrol, his words dripping with contempt. The story was punctuated by chuckles from his colleagues, though some shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to their coffee cups. Eleanor unfolded her newspaper, trying to shield her peace, but the air felt charged with tension. Annie Jones, a 22-year-old black waitress whose grandmother had been Eleanor's student decades ago, approached with a nervous smile. "Morning, Miss Eleanor." "The usual?" she asked, her voice hushed as she cast a wary glance at the officer's table. "Yes, please, Annie," Eleanor replied warmly, her eyes kind and steady. "Maybe the coffee a bit stronger today. I've got a long meeting at the center, and I need to be sharp." Annie nodded, hurrying off with a wide berth around the officers. Eleanor noticed the tension in Annie's shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted as she poured coffee at the counter. Then Carson's voice cut through the diner's hum like a knife. "Look at these people, always wanting special treatment," he sneered, loud enough for every patron to hear. "Strong coffee, weak coffee. What's next, gold-plated spoons?" His colleagues laughed, though some looked uneasy, their gazes fixed on their plates. Eleanor sipped her coffee, trying to focus on her crossword, but the words blurred under the weight of Carson's voice. When Annie returned, her hand trembled slightly as she set down the cup. "I'm sorry, Miss Eleanor, I might have made it too strong," she whispered, her eyes flickering toward Carson's table. "It's perfect, dear," Eleanor said, her voice steady and reassuring, a quiet anchor for the young woman. "Just what I needed." Carson, who had been watching the exchange with narrowed eyes, stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. As Annie turned to leave, he stepped into her path, causing her to stumble slightly. "Excuse me," she murmured, trying to sidestep him, her head lowered. "These people always in the way," Carson said loudly, his voice carrying across the cafe. Then he turned to Eleanor's table, his eyes glinting with malice. "What's wrong with the regular coffee, Grandma? Too good for what everyone else drinks." Eleanor met his gaze with calm dignity, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Nothing's wrong with it, officer," she said, her voice even and measured. "I just asked for it stronger today." What happened next unfolded in a heartbeat, so fast that later accounts would vary among witnesses. Carson took a deliberate step toward Eleanor's table, accidentally bumping it with enough force to tip her coffee cup. Scalding liquid splashed across the table, pouring into Eleanor's lap, soaking her blouse and skirt. She gasped at the searing pain, her hands gripping the table's edge, but she didn't cry out, her composure a shield against the humiliation. The cafe fell silent, forks suspended midair, breaths held, the only sound the faint drip of coffee hitting the floor. Carson feigned surprise, but a smirk played at the corner of his mouth, betraying his intent. "Well, look at that mess," he said, pulling a greasy rag from his belt and tossing it onto the table in front of Eleanor. "Clean yourself up, Grandma." The silence was deafening, a collective holding of breath. Patrons stared at their plates, their phones, anywhere but Eleanor's table. Annie stood frozen at the counter, her eyes wide with horror, her hands pressed to her mouth. No one moved to help, fear or apathy rooting them in place. Then, from a small table near the door, a young white man in a suit stood up, his chair scraping softly. "That was completely unnecessary," he said, his voice firm but controlled as he crossed the room. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she dabbed at the spreading stain with her napkin, the hot liquid burning her skin through the fabric. "I'm fine, thank you," she said quietly, though her voice wavered, betraying the pain she refused to show. "I'm Thomas Reed," the man said, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offering it to her. "I just moved to town to join the Patterson law firm." Carson snorted, his arms crossed. Another bleeding heart lawyer. Just what this town needs. He turned back to his table, where most officers chuckled, though a few looked uneasy, their gazes averted, as if distancing themselves from the moment. Eleanor rose slowly, her dignity intact despite the coffee stain blooming across her clothes. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she said, taking the handkerchief with a steady hand. "I should be getting home now." She placed a $10 bill on the table, despite having received nothing but the spilled coffee, and walked to the door, her back straight, her head held high, each step a quiet act of defiance. Thomas followed her outside into the humid Mississippi morning. "Ma'am, you should report this," he said, his voice urgent. That officer's behavior was unacceptable, it was assault. Away from the cafe's prying eyes, Eleanor's composure cracked, just for a moment. Her hands trembled visibly as she clutched the handkerchief, and Thomas saw pain in her eyes, not just physical but a deeper wound, carved by decades of navigating a world that often refused her respect. "It wouldn't make a difference," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It never does." Thomas insisted on walking her to her modest blue sedan parked on Main Street. "Not many would have spoken up," Eleanor said, wincing as she eased into the driver's seat, the burns stinging with every movement. "Especially someone new to town." Thomas frowned, his hands in his pockets. "I can't understand why no one else did." Eleanor gave a sad smile, her eyes distant. "You'll learn about West Point soon enough, Mr. Reed." As she started the engine, she added, "I need to change before my grandson calls tonight." What Eleanor didn't share was that her grandson, Marcus Wilson Jones, wasn't just any young man. After losing his parents in a car accident at age 8, Eleanor had raised him single-handedly, guiding him through grief and instilling a fierce sense of purpose. Now, at 34, Marcus was returning to West Point as the town's new police chief, determined to bring reform to a department long plagued by bias. Have you ever seen someone stand tall despite injustice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's get this video to 1,000 likes to honor Eleanor's courage. Subscribe to At the Jones Life Stories for more stories that inspire. Share this with a friend who needs to see what dignity can do. Back at her modest home on Maple Street, Eleanor stood before the bathroom mirror, grimacing as she applied aloe vera to the angry red burns on her thighs and stomach. The coffee had left first-degree burns, blisters forming in painful patches across her skin. Each application stung, but she worked methodically, her face set with the resilience of someone who had faced far worse. A knock at the door interrupted her. Thomas Reed stood on her porch, concern etched across his youthful face, his suit slightly wrinkled from the day's heat. "Ms. Washington, I wanted to check on you," he said, shifting his weight. Those burns look serious. You really should go to the hospital. Eleanor shook her head, inviting him into her immaculate living room, where framed photos lined the mantel, telling the story of a life devoted to others. I've dealt with worse than burns in my 70 years, Mr. Reed, she said, sinking into her favorite armchair, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated her injuries. Hospitals ask questions, and questions lead to reports. Reports stir trouble, and trouble has a way of finding those who speak up in West Point. That's exactly what should happen, Thomas said, his voice earnest, his eyes searching hers. What Carson did was assault. He can't just walk away from that. Eleanor's eyes drifted to a photo of a young black couple holding a toddler, their smiles frozen in time. My daughter, Josephine Jones, and her husband Michael, she explained, her voice softening. They died in a car accident 16 years ago. Their son, Marcus, came to live with me after that. Thomas settled on the edge of a sofa, listening as Eleanor wove glimpses of her life's tapestry. She spoke of her 38 years as principal of West Point High School, breaking barriers as the first black woman in administration during a time when segregation's shadow still loomed. During the civil rights era, she'd opened her home for literacy classes and voter registration drives, teaching adults to read so they could pass discriminatory tests at the polls. Threats had come, phone calls in the night, rocks through her windows, but she never flinched. Even in retirement, she remained a pillar of the community, volunteering at the community center, teaching Sunday school at Harmony Baptist Church, and mentoring young people like Annie Jones, who dreamed of a better future. You've lived an incredible life, Thomas said, his voice thick with admiration. Which is why I can't understand why you'd let this incident go unchallenged. The phone rang, cutting her reply short. Eleanor's face softened immediately, a smile breaking through her guarded expression. That'll be Marcus, she said, reaching for the receiver. He calls every Sunday evening, right on schedule. Thomas excused himself, promising to return tomorrow, his briefcase heavy with notes on Carson's history. How's Atlanta treating you, Marcus? Eleanor asked, shifting in her chair to ease the pain of her burns, careful not to let her discomfort seep into her voice. Marcus's deep voice was animated, filled with the excitement of a man on the cusp of change. Just 3 weeks, Grandma. Then I'm home for good. The department set me up with temporary housing until I find a place. They're planning quite the welcome. Mayor Harrington says the department needs new blood. Eleanor's chest swelled with pride. Military service in the Army, a law degree earned through grueling night classes while working as a beat cop in Atlanta, and now, at 34, one of Mississippi's youngest police chiefs. I'm fixing up the spare bedroom for you, she said, her voice deliberately light, choosing not to mention the cafe incident. Why burden him when he was so close to this pivotal transition? Marcus shared more, reviewing personnel files, studying policies, meeting with city officials. Eleanor listened, offering encouragement, skillfully deflecting his questions about her day. After they hung up, she sat in her darkening living room, the burns throbbing, a constant reminder of the morning's humiliation. The weight of silence pressed against her, but so did the memory of Thomas's insistence, the handkerchief he'd offered, the small act of courage that had pierced the cafe's apathy. Across town, Thomas Reed spent his evening in his small apartment above the Patterson law firm, his desk littered with papers. He researched Deputy James Carson, uncovering a disturbing pattern: multiple complaints of racial profiling, excessive force against black suspects, and verbal harassment, all dismissed by the department for insufficient evidence or officer discretion. Each report fueled Thomas's determination. He jotted notes, his pen scratching late into the night, resolved to build a case that could withstand West Point's entrenched power structure. In the days that followed, Eleanor suffered nightmares, scalding coffee splashing, Carson's smirk looming, the cafe's silence suffocating. She woke in cold sweats, her heart racing, the phantom burn still searing her skin. She rebuffed Thomas's repeated suggestions to file a formal complaint. I've lived in West Point my whole life, Mr. Reed, she told him during one of his visits, her voice firm but weary. I know what happens to those who cause trouble. Reports get lost, witnesses forget, and the ones who speak up pay the price. At Harmony Baptist Church on Sunday, Eleanor noticed whispered conversations that halted when she approached. After service, Mrs. Jenkins, the church secretary, hesitantly showed her a petition circulating quietly among the congregation. Titled, "A Call for Citizen Safety and Respectful Treatment by Authorities," it avoided naming Carson but referenced recent incidents at local businesses. Eleanor recognized the indirect nod to her experience, now the subject of town gossip. The petition's existence stirred something in her, a mix of hope and apprehension. People were talking, but fear kept their voices low. Thomas brought worse news during his next visit. Annie Jones had been fired from Sunrise Cafe after customer complaints about her service, though she believed it was retaliation for defending Eleanor to the manager. "I told him what Carson did was wrong," Annie said tearfully when Eleanor called to check on her. "Next thing I know, I'm out of a job." When Thomas arrived at Eleanor's home, he found her offering Annie part-time work helping with her community literacy program. "It's not much," Eleanor said gently, handing Annie a stack of books to organize, "but it'll help until you find something else. You're too bright to let this stop you." Thomas pulled documents from his briefcase, spreading them on Eleanor's dining table. "I've drafted preliminary paperwork to document everything while it's fresh," he said, his voice careful but determined. "Nothing has to be filed yet, but we need to be ready." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "Why does this matter so much to you, Mr. Reed?" Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Because I came to West Point thinking I could make a difference with the law. I grew up hearing stories about justice prevailing, but seeing what Carson did to you, and how everyone just sat there, it hit me hard. If I can't help in a clear-cut case like yours, then what am I doing here?" Their conversation stretched into the evening, the cicadas humming outside as they discussed West Point's deep racial divides, the historical injustices that had shaped the town, and the silent code that protected men like Carson. Eleanor shared stories of her youth, being followed in stores, denied service at diners, hearing slurs whispered behind her back. "Some things change," she said, gazing out at her quiet neighborhood, the streetlights flickering on. "And some just find new ways to stay the same." Have you ever faced a moment where speaking up felt impossible? Share your story in the comments below, and let's hit 1,000 likes to show the world Eleanor's strength. Subscribe to At the Jones Life Stories, and share this video to inspire change. 2 weeks later, Eleanor sat stiffly at her kitchen table as Thomas photographed her healing burns, now dull pink scars etched across her thighs and stomach. "I don't understand why you're agreeing to this documentation now," he said, carefully noting each mark's size and location. Eleanor pointed to a bouquet of yellow roses in a mason jar on the windowsill. "That's the third anonymous delivery this week," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Someone's showing support without risking themselves. If they're finding small ways to stand up, maybe I should too." She didn't mention Carson's increased patrols past her home, his cruiser slowing at odd hours, his spotlight sweeping her porch, an unsubtle intimidation tactic that set her nerves on edge. Across town, Annie struggled with unemployment, her confidence shaken. "They said I had an attitude," she told Eleanor during a tearful phone call. "But I know it was because I spoke up for you. I should have stayed quiet." "You did the right thing," Eleanor said firmly. "Courage isn't free, Annie, but it's worth it. You'll rise above this, I promise." Thomas's investigation revealed Carson's pattern of targeting elderly black residents, excessive tickets for minor infractions like jaywalking, unnecessary searches during routine stops, public humiliation in stores and on street corners, all aimed at those least likely to complain. "He's strategic," Thomas said, his voice grim as he shared his findings with Eleanor. "He picks those who won't fight back, knowing the system will protect him." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised, her eyes distant. "We've always known, Mr. Reed. You just have the training to document it. That's the difference." At Harmony Baptist Church, the congregation was increasingly divided. Some members approached Eleanor after service, whispering support, their eyes darting nervously. Others kept their distance, their silence a shield against potential retaliation. Deacon Williams pulled her aside one Sunday, his voice low. "Carson has friends on the force, Miss Eleanor. People worry about their jobs, their kids. They're afraid." Despite these fears, Eleanor began hosting small gatherings in her living room. 4 or 5 neighbors at first, sitting around her oak dining table, sharing stories over sweet tea and pound cake. Mrs. Patterson, 82, described Carson accusing her of shoplifting at Johnson's grocery, his voice loud enough to draw stares. Mr. Jenkins recounted his 16-year-old grandson being stopped repeatedly while walking home from basketball practice, each encounter laced with veiled threats. Each story strengthened Eleanor's resolve, though she still refused to file a formal complaint, wary of the backlash it would bring. A small breakthrough came when Harold Thompson, editor of the West Point Daily and Eleanor's friend from her teaching days, published an editorial titled The Sacred Trust of Service. Without naming Carson, it called for police to uphold equal respect for all citizens, emphasizing the need for accountability. Carson's reaction was swift and public. He confronted Eleanor at Johnson's grocery, cornering her between the produce section and a display of canned goods. "Think you're clever, getting your media friends involved," he hissed, his voice low but menacing. "Accidents happen to people who don't know their place in this town." Unseen by Carson, Thomas, selecting apples nearby, discreetly recorded the exchange on his phone. That evening, in Eleanor's living room, he played it back, the audio clear despite the store's background noise. For the first time, Eleanor's stoic facade cracked visibly. "He's right about one thing," she said quietly, her hands clasped tightly. "Accidents do happen in West Point, especially to those who challenge the system." Thomas leaned forward, his voice urgent. "This is intimidation, Miss Washington. We have it recorded. We could file a complaint right now." Eleanor held up a hand, her expression resolute. "Not yet, but I think it's time to stop shielding Marcus from the truth." That night, during their weekly call, Eleanor finally told Marcus everything. The cafe incident, the burns that still ached, Carson's grocery store threat, the community's mixed response. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, almost tangible, before Marcus spoke, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I arrive in 10 days, Grandma. I promise you, things are going to change." Was Eleanor right to tell Marcus? Comment, justice, if you think she should have told him sooner, or caution, if you believe this might escalate things. Let's get this video to 1,000 likes to honor her bravery. Subscribe to At the Jones Life Stories and share this story to spark change. The late May's sun gleamed off Marcus Wilson Jones's polished badge as he stood on the steps of West Point City Hall, his 6 feet 2 inches frame and military posture commanding respect from the gathered crowd. At 34, with military police experience and a law degree earned through grueling night classes while working as a beat cop in Atlanta, he was a symbol of progress for a town desperate for change. Eleanor watched her grandson's swearing-in ceremony from the front row, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. Mayor Harrington introduced Marcus as the future of law enforcement in our changing times, emphasizing his hometown roots without mentioning the grandmother beaming nearby, her navy dress concealing the faint scars of her burns. The night before, in Eleanor's cozy living room, Marcus had sat across from her, his broad shoulders tense as she showed him the fading burns and Thomas's meticulous documentation. "This deputy has no idea who you are to me," he said, his fists clenched, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. "I'll handle this by the book, Grandma, but he will face consequences for what he did." Eleanor placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "I raised you to do what's right, Marcus, not what's easy. But be careful. West Point doesn't take kindly to change." At his first departmental meeting, Marcus set a clear tone, his voice steady and authoritative. "Effective immediately, we have zero tolerance for citizen mistreatment," he announced to the assembled officers, his eyes scanning the room. "Every complaint will be thoroughly investigated. Body cameras are mandatory during all citizen interactions. Community trust isn't optional, it's the foundation of our work." Reactions varied. Some officers nodded enthusiastically, their faces bright with hope. Others rolled their eyes, their skepticism palpable. Deputy Carson sat with his arms crossed, whispering to allies, smirks flickering across their faces, a silent challenge to the new chief's authority. Behind closed doors, Carson was bolder, his voice carrying through the locker room as he rallied his supporters. "This community policing garbage won't last 6 months," he told them, his tone dripping with disdain. "These reformers come in with big ideas, but they'll either toughen up or wash out when they see what we really deal with in these neighborhoods." Officer Miguel Rivera, Carson's reluctant partner who had witnessed the cafe incident, overheard from around the corner, his discomfort deepening. He'd stayed silent for too long, torn between department loyalty and a growing disgust with Carson's behavior, but Marcus's words had stirred something in him, a flicker of possibility. Thomas Reed wasted no time briefing Marcus on his findings, spreading documented cases across the chief's desk in the small, cluttered office at the precinct. "It's not just your grandmother," Thomas said, pointing to a stack of complaints. "There's a clear pattern of racial targeting, especially against elderly black residents who are unlikely to complain. Excessive tickets, unwarranted searches, public humiliation, it's all deliberate." Annie Jones had provided a sworn statement about the cafe incident and the harassment that led to her firing. Others from Eleanor's living room gatherings had come forward cautiously, their stories painting a damning picture of Carson's reign of intimidation. "The challenge," Thomas explained, his voice measured, "is that Carson stays just within procedural guidelines while being morally reprehensible. He's smart about covering his tracks, and the department's been complicit in looking the other way." Marcus nodded, absorbing each account, a muscle in his jaw twitching as he maintained his professional composure. "Then we need to observe his current behavior," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll be conducting ride-alongs with various officers, starting with Carson tomorrow." Those ride-alongs proved illuminating. Most officers behaved professionally with their chief present, their radios crackling with routine calls. But Carson couldn't entirely suppress his biases, his true colors seeping through like ink on damp paper. Driving through predominantly black neighborhoods, he made casual remarks about problem areas and these people, his tone laced with contempt. When they stopped for lunch at Sunrise Cafe, Marcus's deliberate choice, Carson complained about the service, his comments, thinly veiled jabs at the staff's diversity. Marcus noted every word, his professional mask unwavering, his pen scratching observations in a small notebook. Meanwhile, Eleanor's community meetings had outgrown her living room, moving to the basement of Harmony Baptist Church, where folding chairs creaked under the weight of growing attendance. What began as 6 people sharing experiences had swelled to over 30 regular attendees, calling themselves West Point Citizens for Equality. They documented police interactions systematically, building a quiet case for change, their voices gaining strength in the safety of the church's worn walls. Eleanor facilitated with her usual grace, her presence a steady anchor, though the burn still ached when she sat too long. Carson's suspicions about Marcus grew with each passing day, his paranoia fueled by the chief's focused attention and detailed questions about patrol patterns. After 2 weeks, Carson began digging into Marcus's background, looking for leverage to undermine him. The discovery hit him like a thunderbolt. Old newspaper clippings about Marcus's academic achievements mentioned his grandmother, Eleanor Johnson Washington, retired principal of West Point High School, the same woman he'd humiliated at Sunrise Cafe. Carson wasted no time spreading the revelation among his supporters in the department. "This whole reform agenda is nothing but a personal vendetta," he insisted, his voice rising in the break room. The chief's using his position to settle family scores. The department began to fracture along increasingly visible lines. Older officers, particularly those with ties to Carson's influential family, closed ranks around him, their loyalty rooted in decades of shared history. Younger officers and those from more diverse backgrounds were drawn to Marcus's professionalism and clear expectations, seeing in him a chance for a better department. The tension was palpable in briefing rooms, patrol car assignments, and whisper conversations in the precinct's hallways. Eleanor found herself unwillingly thrust into the spotlight as Carson's supporters launched a whisper campaign questioning her integrity. The harassment escalated. One morning, she found her mailbox smashed, its contents scattered across her lawn. The next, racist graffiti was sprayed on her garage door, the red paint dripping like blood. When Marcus offered to station a patrol car outside her home, she declined firmly. "That would only confirm their narrative that you're using department resources for personal reasons," she said, scrubbing the paint with a sponge, her hand steady despite the ache in her chest. "I've dealt with worse than vandalism in my 70 years, Marcus." The communities division reached a boiling point when West Point Citizens for Equality organized a rally on the town square, drawing over 100 people with signs reading "Equal Protection Under Law" and "Respect for All Citizens." Marcus, maintaining professional neutrality, arranged appropriate security, and ensured permits were in order. What no one anticipated was Carson arriving with a group of off-duty officers and their supporters, positioning themselves across from the rally with counter-protest signs. "Support our police and stop the witch hunt." When Carson spotted Eleanor among the organizers, he crossed the dividing line, invading her personal space, his voice loud enough for nearby cameras to catch. "Enjoying your grandson's abuse of power, Miss Washington?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Some of us wonder how many policies he's violating with this vendetta." Before Eleanor could respond, Marcus appeared between them, his voice calm but authoritative, his presence a wall of restraint. "Deputy Carson, you're off duty and creating a disturbance at a permitted event. I suggest you rejoin your group, or leave entirely." Carson's face flushed red, his fists clenching, but with local news cameras rolling, he retreated, muttering, "This isn't over, Chief." The confrontation, captured on numerous cell phones, spread through West Point like wildfire, deepening the town's divide. Social media buzzed with hashtags, #Justice for Eleanor and #BackTheBlue, each side digging in. That evening, as Marcus helped Eleanor scrub the latest round of graffiti from her porch, he struggled with the conflict between his professional obligations and personal anger. "He's deliberately provoking me, Grandma," he said, his voice tight as he scrubbed at the paint. "He wants me to lose control so he can claim persecution." Eleanor touched his shoulder gently, her eyes steady. "Then don't give him what he wants, Marcus. Your father used to say the best revenge against hatred is excellence. Led this department with the integrity I raised you to have. What would you do if the system protected those who abuse power? Comment, justice, if you believe in change from within, or revolution if you think only outside pressure creates real change. Let's hit 1,000 likes to honor Eleanor's fight. Subscribe to At the Jones Life Stories and share this story to inspire others." Marcus recused himself from Carson's internal affairs investigation, bringing in an investigator from the Mississippi State Police to ensure impartiality. Carson was temporarily reassigned to administrative duty, a decision that ignited immediate backlash from his supporters within the department. "This is what a witch hunt looks like," Carson declared loudly as he cleared out his patrol car, his voice echoing in the precinct garage. "The chief's grandmother gets her feelings hurt, and suddenly I'm under investigation." The administrative reassignment created a hostile environment for Marcus. Officers loyal to Carson began delaying responses to his directives, their radios crackling with static when he called. Paperwork disappeared from his desk, only to reappear days later with coffee stains. Conversation stopped abruptly when he entered rooms, the air thick with unspoken resentment. Marcus maintained rigid professionalism, focusing on implementing his planned reforms, enhanced training requirements, community engagement initiatives, and a civilian review process for complaints. But the resistance was relentless, a slow grind that tested his resolve. One evening, as Marcus returned from a community meeting, Eleanor discovered her front door standing ajar. Inside, her living room had been ransacked, furniture overturned, books pulled from shelves, family photographs smashed on the hardwood floor. Among the broken glass, she found a handwritten note scrawled in black marker. "Know your place." When Marcus arrived with the responding officers, he found his grandmother calmly sweeping glass, refusing to show fear. "This isn't the first time I've been intimidated," she reminded him, her voice steady. "During integration in the 60s, they burned crosses in my yard. I didn't back down then, and I won't now." But Marcus noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a shattered frame containing a photo of his parents, their smiles cracked across the glass. The balancing act between professional duty and personal outrage became increasingly difficult for Marcus. During late-night research sessions with Thomas at the law firm, they discovered unsettling connections between Carson and West Point's power structure. "His family owns significant property in Parkside," Thomas explained, referring to a historically black neighborhood experiencing recent development pressure. "And his uncle, Councilman William Carson, sits on the city council. There are financial ties between their real estate interests and certain department supervisors who'd be involved in Carson's disciplinary proceedings." More troubling was Carson's new line of attack. Growing desperate as the investigation progressed, he began spreading rumors about a military incident in Marcus's past, a hostage situation in Fallujah where Marcus had been cleared of any wrongdoing but which, taken out of context, raised questions about his judgment. "Ask our new chief about Fallujah," Carson whispered to department skeptics, his voice laced with insinuation. "Ask him how many civilians died because of his call." The rumors spread, sowing doubt among officers already resistant to Marcus's reforms. The stress took its toll on Eleanor. After a community meeting where Carson's supporters showed up to disrupt proceedings, shouting accusations of outside agitators, she experienced chest pains and dizziness. Marcus rushed her to West Point General Hospital, where doctors diagnosed a minor stress-induced stroke. "She needs rest and reduced stress," the doctor advised, giving Marcus a concerned look. "Her blood pressure is dangerously elevated." Word of Eleanor's hospitalization spread quickly, and members of Citizens for Equality organized a prayer vigil outside her room, their candles flickering in the dusk. Messages of support poured in from former students and community members, their cards piling up on her bedside table. Marcus, torn between his grandmother's bedside and his duties as chief, was running on coffee and determination. On the third day of Eleanor's hospitalization, he returned from the cafeteria to find Deputy Carson standing in the doorway of her room, a smirk on his face. "Just checking on a citizen's welfare," Carson said, his tone mocking. After all, accidents happen so easily to elderly folks. Something in Marcus snapped. In 3 quick strides, he had Carson against the wall, his forearm pressed against the deputy's throat. "If you ever come near my grandmother again," he growled, his voice low and dangerous, "badge or no badge, I will." Officer Rivera's voice cut through the moment. "Chief Wilson, sir, this isn't the place," he said, pulling Marcus back and stepping between the two men. Carson rubbed his throat, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Threatening a fellow officer? Assault? Abuse of power? That's quite a list, Chief." Marcus stepped back, realizing his error too late. Carson had deliberately provoked him, and he'd succeeded. Within hours, Carson's attorney had filed a formal complaint about the hospital confrontation. Mayor Harrington called an emergency meeting, his usual political smile replaced by a grim expression. "This is exactly the kind of situation I warned you about, Chief Wilson," he said, pacing his office. "Carson's uncle is pressuring the council. His family's been in West Point for generations. They provide tax revenue we need. They're threatening to withdraw funding for the new community center if this persecution continues. Drop the matter, or you won't have the votes to stay when the council confirms your position next month." Marcus maintained his composure, his hands clasped behind his back. "The internal affairs investigation was properly initiated and is being conducted by state officials, sir. My personal feelings haven't affected department operations." The mayor wasn't convinced, his voice sharp. "Carson's family has deep roots here. I'm asking you to be practical about the realities of our town." Then, a seismic shift. An anonymous source leaked security camera footage from Sunrise Cafe, showing Carson deliberately bumping Eleanor's table, the coffee spilling into her lap, and his smirking reaction as she gasped in pain. The grainy video went viral on social media, drawing attention from regional news outlets and civil rights organizations. Hashtags like #JusticeForEleanor trended, and national advocacy groups contacted Eleanor, offering legal support and media connections. Public opinion began to turn, the image of an elderly black woman enduring such cruelty too stark to ignore. Thomas Reed's persistent investigation yielded critical evidence, financial documents showing connections between the disciplinary board members, the mayor's re-election campaign, and Carson family business interests. "It's a clear conflict of interest," Thomas explained to Marcus, spreading spreadsheets across his desk. "The people judging Carson's case are financially tied to his family." Despite mounting opposition, Marcus continued implementing reforms. He mandated body cameras for all officers, revised use of force protocols, and established a community review board for complaints. Officer Rivera and a growing number of younger officers began openly supporting these changes, creating deeper division within the department. Older officers, loyal to Carson, resisted their passive-aggressive tactics, missing reports, equipment malfunctions, grinding progress to a crawl. Eleanor, against medical advice, organized a peaceful march through downtown West Point. Over 200 citizens participated, walking silently with signs demanding equal justice and respect for all. Carson and several off-duty officers positioned themselves along the route, wearing shirts reading, "Support Real Policing." What began as verbal taunts escalated when Carson deliberately stepped into Marcus's path as he walked alongside the marchers, ensuring their safety. "Hey, Chief, you're destroying this department with your vendetta," Carson accused loudly, cameras from local news capturing every word. "Everyone knows this is personal, not professional." Marcus maintained his calm, his voice steady. "Step aside, deputy. You're interfering with a permitted demonstration." Carson taunted further, stepping closer. "What? You'll assault me again like at the hospital." The confrontation, broadcast on evening news, deep in the town's divisions. Carson supporters placed signs in yards declaring "Stand with Carson," while others displayed "Equality under Law" placards. The department split further, with Rivera and nearly a dozen officers aligning with Marcus's vision, while Carson maintained a shrinking but vocal faction. The mayor, concerned about West Point's deteriorating image, requested state police intervention to restore order and investigate departmental issues. What he hadn't anticipated was the thoroughness of a state investigation, which quickly uncovered decades of systematic racial profiling. Arrest statistics showed Black citizens were 4 times more likely to be detained for identical offenses. Traffic stop data revealed disproportionate targeting of minority neighborhoods for minor infractions like broken taillights. Most damning were internal communications, emails, memos, showing supervisors' awareness of these disparities without any corrective action. While state investigators built their case, Thomas made a critical discovery: dash cam footage from Officer Rivera's patrol car capturing Carson bragging about targeting Eleanor. "Taught that uppity old woman a lesson she won't forget," Carson's voice said clearly, recorded just 20 minutes after the cafe incident with Rivera's camera still active. "These people need reminders about their place sometimes." The footage, legally obtained, provided irrefutable evidence of racial animus. When Thomas brought this to Marcus, Rivera arrived unexpectedly at the chief's office, his expression troubled. "There's more," he said, his voice low. "I've been Carson's partner for 3 years. I've witnessed dozens of similar incidents, stops without cause, harassment, slurs. I stayed quiet because that's what you do to survive here. But I can't anymore." Rivera's decision to come forward represented a seismic shift. Other officers, seeing his example, began sharing their own accounts of Carson's misconduct and the department culture that protected him, their voices breaking the blue wall of silence. As evidence mounted, Carson's supporters began distancing themselves, their loyalty wavering under the weight of public scrutiny. The mayor, sensing shifting political winds, pivoted to supporting necessary departmental reforms. Carson, increasingly isolated, grew desperate. One evening, as Eleanor returned from a community meeting, an unmarked car forced her vehicle off a quiet road near Parkside. 2 masked individuals smashed her windows, shouting, "Tell your grandson to back off, or worse is coming." Eleanor was hospitalized again with elevated blood pressure and minor injuries from shattered glass, her face pale but her resolve unbroken. Marcus, finding his grandmother shaken in the emergency room, nearly submitted his resignation that night, the weight of her suffering crushing him. "This isn't worth your safety," he insisted, holding her frail hand, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor's response was characteristically resolute, her eyes fierce despite her weakened state. "If I quit now, they win, Marcus. Not just against me, but against everyone in West Point who's ever suffered in silence. You keep fighting, you hear me?" The attack on Eleanor became a turning point. Community outrage crossed racial lines, even Carson supporters unable to condone violence against an elderly woman. The state police accelerated their investigation, assigning additional resources. A grand jury was convened to consider criminal charges against Carson and potentially others within the department. Carson, recognizing his deteriorating position, attempted to destroy evidence, deleting text messages, removing files from the department server, pressuring witnesses to recant statements. But Rivera caught him in the act, documenting the attempted cover-up and reporting it immediately to state investigators. As the grand jury proceedings began, West Point's dark history emerged in stark detail: patterns of excessive force against Black residents, suspicious deaths in custody dismissed without investigation, systematic protection of officers regardless of misconduct. Eleanor's former students, now adults with children of their own, came forward with testimonies about her influence, her quiet activism shaping their lives. Her decades of dignity stood in stark contrast to Carson's record of intimidation and bias. An unexpected ally emerged during this critical juncture. 87-year-old retired police chief Walter Donovan, who had led the department during the civil rights era. In halting testimony to the grand jury, he admitted witnessing years of misconduct he had failed to address. "I was wrong," the elderly man said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I chose department loyalty over justice, and people suffered because of my silence." Donovan's advanced age and declining health made his appearance all the more impactful, his confession a powerful narrative of institutional failure and the possibility of redemption through truth-telling. Thomas Reed faced his own challenges. Anonymous threats escalated. His office was vandalized, client files destroyed, a brick thrown through his apartment window with a note reading "Race Traitor." Yet he continued building the case, his legal expertise sharpening the evidence against Carson and his enablers from her hospital bed. Eleanor recorded a public statement that went viral online. "West Point stands at a crossroads," she declared, her voice weak but determined. "We can choose justice and equality, or remain trapped in the shadows of our past. This isn't about me, my grandson, or even Deputy Carson. It's about the community we want for our children and grandchildren." Carson, panicked by the mounting evidence and public pressure, made a desperate move. Late one night, he emptied his bank accounts, packed a suitcase with essential belongings, and fled jurisdiction with his service weapon and $10,000 in cash. Highway patrol officers stopped him at the Louisiana state line, his arrest broadcast on local and national news, a powerful symbol of accountability within the West Point Police Department. What would you do against systemic injustice? Share your story in the comments below, and let's hit 1,000 likes to honor Eleanor's fight. Subscribe to The Jones Life Stories and share this video to inspire change. The fallout from Carson's arrest was immediate and far-reaching. 7 officers submitted resignations rather than face scrutiny under Marcus's new standards, their departure a quiet admission of complicity. Others scrambled to distance themselves from Carson, suddenly recalling incidents of concern they had previously ignored. Marcus found himself leading a department in transition, understaffed but increasingly committed to reform. "This gives us an opportunity," he told his remaining staff during an emergency meeting, his voice steady. "We can rebuild this department with officers who understand what it means to protect and serve everyone in this community." Carson's trial laid bare West Point's underbelly, each day of testimony peeling back layers of systemic corruption. Officer Rivera's account of the cafe incident, backed by the damning dash cam footage, was devastating, his voice steady as he described Carson's glee in targeting Eleanor. Afterward, in the patrol car, he bragged about teaching her a lesson about her place, Rivera said, his eyes fixed on the jury. "It wasn't an isolated incident. It was consistent with behavior I witnessed for years." Other officers followed, their testimonies illuminating a department culture that had normalized misconduct. Eleanor's testimony came near the trial's conclusion. Moving slowly to the witness stand with Marcus's assistance, she recounted the cafe incident with remarkable precision and composure, her voice carrying the weight of her 68 years. When asked about the impact of Carson's actions, she expanded her response beyond personal harm. "This was never just about me," she said, her eyes sweeping the courtroom. "It's about every citizen who has swallowed their dignity because they feared the consequences of speaking up. It's about the community we can become when justice applies equally to everyone." Carson's defense portrayed him as a product of his environment, a scapegoat for institutional failures. His attorney emphasized Carson's service record, his family's historical contributions to West Point, and the departmental culture that had normalized such behavior. "If Deputy Carson is guilty," the attorney argued, "then so is every officer who witnessed such conduct and remained silent, every supervisor who dismissed complaints, every official who maintained the status quo." The strategy gained little traction as former allies abandoned Carson, and new witnesses came forward daily, their stories corroborating the prosecution's case. The jury's deliberations lasted 5 days, an eternity for a community balanced on the edge of transformation. Citizens gathered on the courthouse steps each day, some praying silently, others holding signs, all waiting for a verdict that would either validate or dismiss their experiences. Marcus continued his duties as chief, privately preparing for either outcome, public celebration or potential unrest, depending on the jury's decision. When the verdict came, it reflected the case's complexity. Carson was found guilty of assault, civil rights violations, and witness intimidation, facing a 4-year prison sentence. He was acquitted on charges of conspiracy and evidence tampering due to insufficient evidence linking him directly to broader departmental schemes. The mixed verdict satisfied neither side completely but represented undeniable accountability for the most egregious misconduct. The sentencing phase began immediately, with character witnesses and impact statements from both sides. Carson's family and supporters emphasized his service record, portraying the incidents as aberrations rather than patterns. Community members affected by his actions described lasting trauma, their trust in institutions shattered. When Eleanor was called for her victim impact statement, the courtroom fell completely silent. Moving slowly to the podium with Marcus's assistance, she faced Carson directly for the first time since the cafe incident. "I've had months to consider what I would say to you if given the opportunity," she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I could speak about the physical pain from the burns, the humiliation of that moment in the cafe, or the fear during the later intimidation, the vandalism, the threats, the attack on my car. Instead, I want to speak about possibility. West Point stands at a crossroads. The harm you caused extends beyond individuals to our entire community's ability to trust those sworn to protect us. Your punishment matters less to me than the changes your actions have finally made possible. I hope someday you understand that treating everyone with dignity isn't weakness. It's the foundation of true justice." Throughout Eleanor's statement, Carson maintained the defiant expression he had shown throughout the trial, offering no acknowledgement of the harm caused or remorse for his actions. This demeanor continued as the judge pronounced the sentence, even as the reality of incarceration loomed. As bailiffs led Carson from the courtroom in handcuffs, a chapter was closing on one individual's misconduct, but West Point's journey toward transformation was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, citizens gathered, not in celebration or protest, but in quiet acknowledgement that accountability, however imperfect, represented progress in a community long accustomed to injustice without consequence. Marcus found his grandmother sitting alone on a bench in the courthouse corridor after most spectators had departed. "Was it enough?" he asked softly, taking the seat beside her. Eleanor considered the question carefully, her eyes tracing the cracks in the marble floor. "It's a beginning," she said finally, her voice steady. "Not an ending. Can one person's dignity change a system? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's get this video to 1,000 likes to celebrate Eleanor's courage. Subscribe to The Jones Life Stories and share to spread her story. 6 months after James Carson's sentencing, West Point was a community in transformation. The former deputy's conviction was upheld on appeal, though his sentence was reduced by 8 months due to a technical issue with sentencing guidelines, setting his release for 3 years and 4 months. For Eleanor Johnson Washington, sitting on her front porch with the morning newspaper announcing the decision, the legal outcome had become almost secondary to the changes she witnessed daily in her beloved town. The Eleanor Washington Scholarship for Minority Students in Law Enforcement, established through community donations, had awarded its first recipient, Jamal Jones Taylor, Annie's younger brother, a bright, thoughtful 19-year-old who had once feared police but now saw a path to change from within. Jamal's acceptance to the police academy symbolized hope, a bridge between past pain and future possibility. Eleanor mentored him personally, sharing stories of resilience over tea in her living room, her burns now faint scars but her spirit undimmed. Inside the police department, Marcus implemented comprehensive reforms despite significant challenges. Body cameras were now standard equipment for all officers, their red lights blinking during every interaction. Complaint procedures have been streamlined and made transparent, with a public database tracking outcomes. Community policing initiatives had officers regularly engaging with citizens in non-enforcement contexts, coffee chats at local businesses, youth mentorship programs, neighborhood walk-alongs. Most significantly, racial bias training became mandatory, with quarterly refresher courses and practical applications designed to shift mindsets, not just check boxes. "We're not just changing policies," Marcus explained during a community forum at the high school auditorium, his voice carrying to the packed room. "We're fundamentally changing how we understand our role in this community. Protecting and serving means everyone, no exceptions." The reforms hadn't come easily. Several veteran officers resigned rather than adapt to new standards, their departure a quiet purge of resistance. Budget constraints required creative resource allocation, with Marcus negotiating grants to fund training. Community trust, damaged by generations of unequal treatment, couldn't be restored overnight, but measurable progress emerged. Citizen complaints decreased by 30%, while voluntary community engagement, town halls, youth programs surged. Thomas Reed was appointed to chair the newly established Civilian Oversight Board, bringing legal expertise and a deep commitment to West Point's transformation. His law practice had evolved, now focusing on civil rights and community advocacy, with a growing staff of young attorneys drawn to his mission. The storefront that once housed his solo practice now accommodated 4 associates, 2 paralegals, and a steady stream of clients seeking representation, emboldened by the town's shift to seek justice. The price of his involvement had been steep: vandalism, threats, lost clients. But for every door that closed, others opened, his reputation as a principled advocate growing. Officer Miguel Rivera, whose courage in providing dash cam footage had helped break the case, was promoted to sergeant and placed in charge of community relations. His unique perspective as a Latino officer who had witnessed discrimination from multiple angles made him particularly effective at building bridges between the department and historically marginalized communities. Rivera led weekly coffee meetups at Sunrise Cafe, where officers and citizens shared stories, breaking down barriers over steaming mugs. His promotion inspired younger officers, who saw in him a model of integrity in a department once defined by silence. 1 year after the cafe incident, West Point gathered to honor Eleanor at a community ceremony in the high school auditorium, where she had served as principal for nearly 4 decades. The crowd reflected the town's diversity: elderly citizens who remembered the civil rights era, middle-aged adults who had been Eleanor's students, young people inspired by recent events to engage with community issues. Mayor Harrington, who had once pressured Marcus to abandon the investigation, presented Eleanor with the key to the city, his speech praising her lifetime commitment to dignity and justice. Marcus watched from the sidelines, amused by the political pivot but appreciative of the recognition his grandmother deserved, her navy dress a quiet echo of the day that started it all. West Point's transformation drew national attention, with law enforcement agencies from other communities requesting information about Marcus's reformed policies and implementation strategies. Criminal justice programs at universities like Ole Miss and Jackson State developed case studies based on the department's transition, analyzing how a small town confronted its past. Civil rights organizations cited the West Point model in policy papers advocating for similar reforms nationwide, with Eleanor's story often at the center, her quiet dignity a universal symbol. Carson's appeal denial ensured he would serve his reduced sentence, though his attorney immediately announced plans to pursue further legal challenges. The former deputy showed no remorse, maintaining he was scapegoated for practices normalized by the department for generations. Meanwhile, the department he once dominated continued its evolution. New officers, recruited from within the community, brought fresh perspectives and stronger local connections. Among them was Jamal Jones Taylor, whose decision to enter law enforcement represented powerful symbolism about possibility and change. Under Marcus's leadership, the department began a delicate process of reconciliation with officers who had initially supported Carson but now acknowledged the necessity of reform. "We can't build a divided department," Marcus told his staff during a meeting, his voice firm but inclusive. "Those willing to embrace change deserve the opportunity, regardless of past positions." Officer Peterson, once Carson's vocal supporter, had gradually become an advocate for community policing after seeing positive results firsthand: fewer arrests, more trust in his patrol area. His evolution, imperfect but genuine, represented the potential for institutional change when guided by clear leadership. Eleanor's living room, where small gatherings had once whispered about injustice, now hosted the Community Advisory Council, a formal entity with direct input on policing policies and practices. The transformation from grassroots resistance to structured partnership symbolized West Point's evolving approach to governance and accountability. The council reviewed complaints, proposed training, and ensured transparency. Its members a cross-section of the town: teachers, business owners, retirees, youth. Sunrise Cafe, where the confrontation began, had changed ownership after the previous manager retired amid the controversy. The new proprietor, James Jones Washington, no relation to Eleanor, was a young black entrepreneur who had transformed the space into an unofficial headquarters for community police relations. The cafe's walls were adorned with local artwork, its staff reflecting West Point's diversity. Officers stopped by regularly for coffee, engaging citizens in neutral territory, building relationships beyond enforcement contexts. James, inspired by Eleanor's story, named a signature drink after her, the Eleanor Blend, a strong, smooth coffee that became a bestseller. Thomas Reed and Annie Jones developed both a professional partnership and a personal relationship, collaborating on a community law clinic while exploring a connection that had begun during the darkest days of the controversy. Annie, now working full-time at the community center and studying part-time for a degree in social work, found purpose in helping others navigate challenges, her resilience shaped by Eleanor's mentorship. Their story represented an unexpected positive outcome, a reminder that hope can emerge from hardship, connections forged across differences during times of community stress. For Eleanor, the most significant development was personal. After a lifetime of stoic endurance, she finally allowed herself to process the trauma she had experienced.
Not just from the cafe incident and subsequent intimidation, but from decades of navigating systemic racism with quiet dignity. Weekly counseling sessions with a therapist at the community center helped her acknowledge buried pain, the weight of slurs, threats, and exclusion she'd carried since childhood. "I spent so long being strong for others," she told Marcus one evening on her porch, the swing creaking softly. "I forgot how to be gentle with myself." The national spotlight on West Point eventually dimmed as media attention shifted elsewhere, but the foundational changes continued. Marcus implemented reforms methodically, building sustainable structures rather than quick fixes. The Civilian Oversight Board reviewed policies and complaints with increasing sophistication, its members trained in legal and procedural standards. Community partnerships evolved from symbolic gestures to substantive collaboration, with joint programs addressing youth violence, housing, and education. Exactly 1 year after the incident, Eleanor returned to Sunrise Cafe for the first time since the confrontation. The space had been renovated, brighter colors, local artwork, a diverse staff bustling behind the counter. She took her old seat by the window, ordered the Eleanor Blend, and opened her newspaper, reclaiming the routine that had been disrupted. Officer Peterson, who had once stood silently while Carson assaulted her, approached her table in uniform. He had requested the downtown foot patrol specifically for this day, knowing Eleanor might return on the anniversary. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice unsteady but determined, "I want to ensure everything is just right for you today." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, seeing the discomfort, but also the sincerity. "Thank you, officer," she said, her voice warm. "The coffee is perfect." Across the street, Marcus watched the interaction from his parked cruiser, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He joined Eleanor for lunch later, the two of them sharing a quiet meal, the cafe humming with life around them. "I always knew West Point could be better," Eleanor said, stirring her coffee with a steady hand, her eyes bright with conviction. "Sometimes, people just need a little push to do what's right." The transformation was incomplete, the work ongoing. Racial tensions still simmered in corners of the town, and budget cuts loomed, threatening some programs. But in the simple act of reclaiming her morning coffee, Eleanor Johnson Washington had come full circle, not just surviving injustice, but catalyzing the change her community had long needed. Her legacy was etched not only in the scholarship, the reform department, or the council, but in the countless lives touched by her refusal to surrender her dignity. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination in your community? Would you have the courage to stand up like Eleanor, even when the system pushes back? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's get this video to 1,000 likes to celebrate Eleanor's legacy. Subscribe to The Jones Life Stories for more powerful stories of justice and transformation. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that change is possible, even in the most resistant systems. Eleanor Washington's story teaches us that dignity is a force more powerful than hatred. In a world where discrimination often goes unchallenged, her quiet strength became the catalyst for systemic change. This reminds us that transformation rarely comes from grand gestures, but from ordinary people who refuse to surrender their humanity in the face of prejudice. True justice requires both individual courage and collective action. Eleanor's personal stand inspired a community movement, while Marcus's institutional position enabled structural reform. The story illustrates how deeply racism can be embedded within systems, protected by those with power and privilege who benefit from the status quo. Yet it also demonstrates that these systems are not impenetrable. When documentation, persistence, and strategic action combine with moral clarity, even entrenched injustice can be dismantled. Perhaps most importantly, Eleanor shows us that age and perceived vulnerability need not limit one's impact. Her lifetime of quiet dignity prepared her for the moment when standing firm would ripple outward, touching countless lives beyond her own. Real change is rarely swift or complete, but it begins with someone who refuses to accept that injustice is inevitable. Her story is a call to action, to notice the small injustices around us, to speak up even when it's hard, to believe that our actions, however small, can bend the arc of history toward justice. Has someone's quiet dignity in the face of discrimination ever inspired you to take a stand? Share your stories in the comments below. Have you witnessed racism in your community and wondered how to respond? Tell us your experiences or thoughts on how ordinary people can create extraordinary change. If Eleanor's journey touched your heart, please hit that like button to help us reach 1,000 likes and spread her story far and wide. Subscribe to The Jones Life Stories to hear more accounts of courage and transformation that remind us justice is possible, even in the most resistant systems. And if you know someone who needs inspiration to stand up against discrimination, share this video with them as a reminder that one person's refusal to surrender their dignity can spark a movement. Thank you for joining us on this journey through West Point's awakening. May it inspire similar transformations wherever you're watching from.